Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Moment. This is going to be a fortnightly show here on YouTube in which I talk about some of the goings-on in Northumberland, as well as talk about some other discussion topics that are sort of more broad or just of interest to me. And basically this show's about trying to bring Northumberland to a wider audience, because there's so many people who just don't know what happens up in this neck of the woods, and who might be interested to know, or who might see how these things could apply to them. You know, if you live in Newcastle and you think that maybe what I'm talking about isn't immediately applicable, well, it may end up being in the future, because some of these things could happen anywhere, and in fact, one of these is going to be happening in Newcastle. I've got a story about constituency boundary changes which are going to affect people right the way down to North Tyneside. Huge reshuffle is going to be taking place, or has been proposed to take place in 2018. So that's something we're going to get onto a little bit later on. Also, the first story is going to be about the demolition of County Hall in Morpeth and what's going to replace it. And then I've also got a interview that I did a couple of weeks back on Brexit, which should just be an interesting topic to listen to. So with that in mind, let's get right down to the first story of the day. So the first story comes out of Morpeth, where the county hall is set to be demolished, and there have been 3 proposals put to Northumberland County Council as to what's going to go in the space. Now, all 3 proposals have been accepted by the council at a meeting on the 7th. So all of these will be going ahead, and the proposals were for a new first school, a retail park, and some new houses, up to 200 houses. Now, this has sparked a lot of protests, and in fact there was one outside of County Hall just before the meeting, and I was talking to some people there who gave quite a few different misgivings about it. Some people saying that these new plans didn't fit within the Morpeth neighbourhood plan. Now, a neighbourhood plan essentially stipulates that the councils have to work closely with the residents in order to try and work out developments that benefit everyone. And a lot of people, in fact pretty much everyone at the protest, was concerned that the council wasn't sticking to this neighbourhood plan, that they hadn't been properly consulted about these developments before going ahead with them. One person in particular said that they didn't like the idea of this retail park, which is going to have a McDonald's in it, being right opposite a first school. But here are some other people's opinions from that protest.
I think the developers have a stranglehold on Morpeth from every direction. North, south, east and west. They're just building, chopping down trees, demolishing buildings, but there's no infrastructure, nothing in its place, no local chemists, no small shops, things that would be of value to the community. Yes, schools, I'm all for schools, a new school for the old one at Goose Hill, but they're killing Morpeth.
It just seems like it's a money grab exercise rather than like something for the people of Morpeth. They've already spent a lot of money in the town centre, and it's gonna sort of detract from that, and then we're gonna have a high street which is gonna have more shops that haven't got anything in them. So yeah, I just feel strongly that it's just not needed.
It's very important because Morpeth is a small market town. It's got a high street which is currently managing, and it needs to flourish. This will destroy it, and I think the intent has been all along to destroy Morpeth, turn it into another Ashington by taking all the charm and putting all the things that the people of Morpeth do not want, because one man wants it to his benefit and to the benefit of the other councillors, Labour councillors, and it's wrong.
And really, I think all that's pretty fair. And the question of who this benefits really sticks out the most. Certainly, the people of Morpeth don't seem to think that they're going to benefit from it. And when you look at Morpeth, we are talking about a relatively small town which has a lot of local businesses. It has a lot of interesting shops already, and it has the Sanderson Arcade, which was only redeveloped a few years ago to encourage people to shop there. So this whole retail park especially flies in the face of that. Why would the council approve such a thing when it's seemingly not for the benefit of anybody who actually lives in the town? If the idea is to try and encourage people from outside Morpeth to come into the town, well, that creates more problems as well, because Morpeth streets are very small, especially when you get into the town centre, and so encouraging tons of people to come and shop in Morpeth isn't necessarily a good idea, because it's going to put pressure on the infrastructure that's already there. It doesn't seem like it's a plan that was thought out with the people in mind, unfortunately, and that's the real drawback to all of this. That's the real problem to this entire thing, is that 1,000 people protested this. When the plans were initially released, 1,000 people took to the streets, all local residents of Morpeth, to say no to this. And when I was walking down the streets, pretty much every house had a say no banner outside of it, a sign outside. So the public opinion is pretty obvious, and yet this went ahead regardless. Now, obviously it wasn't a completely unanimous vote, but even so, you really have to start wondering who it is exactly that the council is trying to serve here by doing this. And it's very much up in the air at this point. Obviously, with all these applications going ahead, it's going to be a lot of time before the actual effect of this starts to take hold. I mean, obviously at this point, it's all rather academic. It's all very emotive at this point. And while the prospects don't necessarily look good, it may encourage healthy growth. It may be that people who come in also check out some of the other shops that are in Morpeth, some of the smaller businesses, and try to help them along as well. The problem is we don't know, and the council hasn't exactly been upfront with their policies. It hasn't exactly been upfront with really what this is going to do to Morpeth. I mean, the development itself is outside of the city centre. That should be, or the town centre, that should be noted. This is not going to be right in the heart of Morpeth, but it's still going to affect the town pretty heavily. So we'll have to see what comes out of that. If any new updates come out of that, we'll have to see. So there's definitely a lot of very interesting things to be talked about there. But right now it's time to move on to the second part of this show. Now, this isn't a story per se. This is just an interview that I did with Professor Tim Wilson from Northumbria University. Now, Professor Wilson generally supports the EU and believes that if the UK were to stay within it, we would have more influence over some of the decisions that are made in the EU. But he does have some misgivings about the economic situation, and that was one of the things that I talked to him about and got his opinion on.
When one reads the work of experts such as Joseph Stiglitz, the renowned economist, he points out that the euro is imposing a tremendous economic and social strain on the countries of the eurozone. It has not been unsuccessful in terms of countries with stronger economies, such as Germany and the Netherlands, and one only has to look at the Netherlands, where the steel industry is much stronger than the steel industry in the United Kingdom. But when one thinks about the levels of youth unemployment in Portugal, Spain, Italy, possibly even France, the way in which economies are having to cope with a currency that operates at the same level of conversion to the dollar and other global currencies, and yet there are no ways for central government to manage the problems within those economies. One begins to see the weakness of the Eurozone project. And like Stiglitz, one wonders if the Eurozone in its current form can possibly survive.
Yeah, I mean that's quite aptly demonstrated with Greece, I think, when they lied to get in basically, and that's put an enormous strain on things.
Yes, I agree. I'd always had doubts, and when I was in the Treasury, my own view, though I wasn't directly concerned with that area of policy, was that some of the candidate countries for Euro membership were highly suspect on the basis of what it was quite easy to learn about those countries without a great deal of scrutiny and digging into details. One would just observe the day-to-day way in which they conducted their business. And I think the Eurozone should have started with a much smaller zone of countries that were much more compatible, and also should have considered whether it was actually feasible to advance the Eurozone without some degree of central financial control. I mean, the ideas behind the Eurozone were perfectly valid because it was introduced very much at the time of German reunification because of concerns that a reunified Germany might dominate Europe. When people had been quite comfortable living with a divided Germany since the end of the Second World War. And in many respects it was a laudable idea to introduce the Eurozone to try and promote European political stability. Unfortunately, we now experience a situation where the Eurozone is potentially a major cause of Eurozone instability and is being used as a powerful weapon.
I think he makes a lot of good points there, especially about the economic situation in the European Union, the fact that everyone's getting weaker together as opposed to stronger together, which was pretty much the exact opposite of what the EU should be. Me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of the European Union. I think that it's gotten too big, and I think that was something that Professor Wilson alluded to when he was talking about the fact that they should have started with a smaller block of countries to work from. But that's really a debate for another day. But of course, because his general area, or his area of expertise, is in the criminal justice system, he does talk about the transference of DNA information between different countries and the police forces of those countries having access to such things. And that's really not something that I think a lot of people necessarily would talk about with regards to something like the European Union and its potential benefits. So I think this is something that's pretty important to hear, even if, like me, you're not necessarily a fan, shall we say, of the EU itself.
When we look at forensic science DNA, a lot of progress has been made in recent years to take existing national DNA kits, if I can use that term to keep this very simple, to a more standard base, so that DNA information about individuals can be exchanged between countries more cost effectively, and indeed the use of forensic DNA in criminal investigations within a country can be more cost effective because the manufacturers, who are mainly American bioscience companies, are producing for a larger market, therefore everyone benefits from economies of scale. Now the UK did very well out of that convergence, European standards have increasingly converged to UK national standards, and the European standards converging in our direction also converged with the new standards introduced by the FBI in the USA. And behind the scenes, the Chinese have been watching this, and their DNA kits have also converged to a common standard. So a huge DNA database, which was threatened by becoming technologically obsolescent, is not going to be technologically obsolescent. For most purposes, it will still be a usable and valuable resource. Had the UK not been so influential within the European Union, we could not have guaranteed such a beneficial outcome. And one only has to hope that after Brexit, that we will still be able to retain such influence.
Some pretty interesting food for thought there from Professor Tim Wilson, and that was a really good interview because it really sort of got me thinking about how these systems work and how it's one thing to say that countries should be able to exist on their own and should be able to exist outside of a system like the EU. But the problem is that it's become so part and parcel of so many different aspects, not just economic and social, but also in terms of criminal investigations. It's become such an important and pivotal thing that any discussion of moving out of it throws up all kinds of potential difficulties. And that's really something that is going to have to be talked about on an individual level as more and more countries start to become skeptical of the European Union, as we are seeing in France and the Netherlands most prominently. Those types of concerns are going to have to be addressed. Will there still be some kind of overarching criminal investigations network to be able to facilitate this information where it's needed? And if so, then is that still just a carryover from the EU, or will that be its own thing? I mean, this is all completely speculative, of course, but it's interesting to think about, and I think I hope this interview has inspired some of you to maybe think about some of this stuff yourselves. But now it's time to move on to the third and final part of this show, where I'm going to be talking about boundary changes. Now, this is something that's been stewing for a while, but the Border Commission, or the Boundary Commission for England, has just recently released, which I have right here, initial proposals for new parliamentary constituency boundaries in the North East. So this is how the boundary changes are going to be affecting things in the North East, and I do recommend that you go and look up this document actually, because it is quite useful. It has every new constituency or potential new constituency listed and exactly what areas are going to come under those new constituencies, so it is quite a good document to look at. But basically, the reason this is happening is because in 2011 there was a parliamentary ruling that said that instead of 650 constituencies in the UK, there now have to be 600. So 50 constituencies have to go, which means redrawing the constituency boundaries across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Essentially, they're trying to make it so that every constituency has between 71,031 and no more than 78,507 electors within its borders. That's from the report itself. And they go on to say that under the old rules, or how things currently are, there was meant to be a sort of average number of people within constituencies, or average number of electors within constituencies, but this could vary wildly from 54,232 to 105,448 electors for the larger constituencies. So there is definitely a discrepancy in terms of the number of electors per constituency currently, and this new proposal looks to try and change that. So in order to figure out why this is happening, there's an article from BBC News from actually last September in which they say that following the expenses scandal of 2009, if you remember that, quote, Mr. Cameron was pushing out an open door with his call for the number of MPs to be cut to reduce the cost of politics. Okay, and they go on to say that this idea gelled well with the age of austerity that was around at that time. So basically it was seen as a bit of a cost-cutting measure for the government. If they have less MPs, then there are less people earning money, I suppose. It seems a bit of a tenuous thing. There have been concerns from Labour that this is going to affect them worse because essentially a lot of the Labour constituencies are inner cities, or they're in the country, places that have less electoral turnout than most other constituencies. There could be something to that. I mean, the town I live in, Bedlington, currently comes under Wansbeck. That's the constituency it exists in. But under the new proposals, under the new constituencies, Wansbeck doesn't exist anymore. I don't think it's too much of a problem because it does seek to try and level the playing field in terms of the number of people that are within a constituency. And it's not going to change electoral turnout. They are just drawing up proposals, and they do make a point of saying, I'm quoting from the actual report here, it says, we ask people to be aware that in publishing our initial proposals, we do so without suggesting that they are in some way the definitive or that they provide the right answer. So this is all still very much up in the air. These changes are set to come in within the next few years. So this is just really the beginnings of what could be, as opposed to them dictating how these new places are going to be set out. And I think it's very important to spell that out. This is not necessarily how things are going to be. So that's just something to keep in mind. But that's all for this time. I certainly hope that there was something interesting in this, that maybe something in here made you think about something that you hadn't thought of before, and if that's the case, then I'll consider this a job well done, and I will be continuing with this in a fortnight's time, or I will be doing another show in a fortnight's time, so I will see you then. Until then, my name is Oliver Ralph, and this is The Moment.